Good afternoon, KCA listeners, and good afternoon and good evening to those listening to us on the live stream link. There's the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host, and today my guest is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing again. We have her on again because why? Because I think the black community is absolutely devastated over the Zimmerman verdict. So we want to get at this. We want to analyze it. We want to pull it apart, analyze it, strip it, understand it. Essentially understand what is going on. So Dr. Welsing is a psychiatrist who utilizes a unique field theory of psychiatry, utilizing a broader framework encompassing biology, psychology, and physics to understand racial conflict. Dr. Welsing's practice is in Washington, D.C., and is noted for her Cress theory of color confrontation, which explores the practice of white supremacy. Dr. Welsing is the author of the ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors. She is a lecturer and has appeared on numerous television shows and radio programs. And this is who we must go to understand what's going on. We don't listen to Rush Limbaugh. We don't listen to Bill O'Reilly, because I heard recently they had rants about the Zimmerman verdict, and they tried to understand or try to explain the reason for the verdict. But that's not who black folks go to understand racism and try to get a handle on it. We don't go to Bill O'Reilly. We don't go to Rush Limbaugh. We go to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. So, Dr. Welsing, thank you for joining me again today.
Yes, I'm very glad to be with you.
Well, why don't we start again with your definition, because I know we may have some new listeners. So why don't we start again with your definition of racism so that we can go from there, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
White supremacy, in parentheses, racism, or racism, in parentheses, white supremacy, is the local and global power system and dynamic, structured and maintained by persons who classify themselves as white, whether consciously or subconsciously determined, which consists of patterns of perception, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, and emotional response, as conducted simultaneously in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, for the ultimate purpose of white genetic survival and to prevent white genetic annihilation on planet Earth, a planet upon which the vast and overwhelming majority of people are classified as non-white, meaning black, brown, red, and yellow, by white-skinned people. And all of the non-white people are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration compared to the genetic recessive white-skinned people. Now, I maintain that no person should talk about racism, white supremacy, until they state their definition of what it is that they're talking about. And this is one of the reasons why there's so much confusion. People think they can just throw the term racism around, but then if you say, well, define your terms, define what you mean, then they're at a loss. And that's why a lot of discussions sound very confusing. I think there is an attempt on CNN, for example, with Anderson Cooper, to have kind of community dialogues about racism or race. And you have people giving different points of view, but there's nothing in depth that is really being said to explain why racism, white supremacy as a behavioral phenomenon has existed 500 years in this area of the world alone. So that's my definition.
Mm-hmm. And you can't really have an effective or meaningful discussion of any issue unless you define the terms.
Exactly.
Right. And people constantly throw the word around racism. In fact, I'm often called a black racist. And then I say, well, what do you mean by that? Define racism. And a lot of people think if I discuss race, if I say black folks and white folks, oh, therefore I'm racist.
Right. Well, see, I maintain that there's tremendous sensitivity around the discussion of racism, and I say that it is because racism is a survival system for people who classify themselves as white, and they do not want to confront their behavior. They don't want to look in the mirror and understand that they don't mind saying that they are superior, they're the ones in power. For example, if you turn on the television, you see white. You go in any corporation, white. You look at the Congress, white. A few blacks, a few maybe Asians, but white. People who classify themselves as white have the dominant power position, not only in this area of the world, but throughout the world. But they are a tiny minority, and they are genetic recessive. If somebody doesn't understand, just look at President Barack Obama. His mother was white. His father was black. His mother, white, is a genetic recessive trait. Black, the ability to produce the black pigment melanin, is a genetically dominant trait. And so when genetic recessive, genetic dominance comes together, the product is going to be a person of color. And so if everybody, for example, you take everybody in the world, 9/10 of the people are people of color. If you mix the 9/10 people of color and the 1/10 people whose skins are white, if they all mixed together, they all loved each other, they weren't looking at color, white would disappear. Well, white people, consciously, subconsciously, but I've talked to audiences of white people, and I say, do you want your children to be colored? Do you want your grandchildren to be colored? Great. I'm polite and they're polite. They say no. And I say, if you mean that, on a planet where white is a numerical tiny minority and a genetic recessive population, then you have to end up doing certain things to make certain that white does not get genetically annihilated and that white does not disappear. And that takes us directly to the Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin tragedy. White people feel that for them to be able to survive, consciously or subconsciously, they have to be able to kill non-white people in general, black people in particular, because black people have the greatest genetic potential to cause white genetic annihilation. And so the accusation is either I'm afraid of him, and see, it's the men, only men can impose sexual intercourse, whether it's a white slave master or any other person of color. That women cannot impose sexual intercourse. A woman can't frighten a man and force him to have sexual intercourse because he wouldn't be able to maintain an erection. This is just basic human physiology. So it's the male, the black male, that is the center of the focus of who has to be destroyed for white genetic survival. And this is why all of the cases, like Trayvon Martin, where a white male may say, oh, he frightened me. I thought he had a weapon, and now the black man is dead. Well, Trayvon Martin had a can of iced tea and some candy on his way home, a child, a teenager on his way home. George Zimmerman, who classifies himself as white, even though his ethnicity may be described as Hispanic, he saw Trayvon. He saw a black male. He started following him, pursuing him, was told not to get out of his car. He got out of his car anyway, and the next thing, the black male child has a hole in his heart, and he's dead instantly. Then people start making excuses, making justifications. It's no different than a white police officer killing a black man, and it ended up being called justifiable homicide. The subtext is justifiable for the purpose of white genetic survival. That's what stand your ground is. Stand your ground doesn't mean if Trayvon Martin got afraid of George Zimmerman, and if he, God forbid, had a weapon, and because this white male was pursuing him, he didn't know him, he was frightened, so if he had a gun and shot Zimmerman, he would be under the jail, if not dead before he got to the jail cell. So this is the reality that we have to be able to talk about if there's going to be any meaningful resolution of the issue of race. And race is only of importance in a system of racism. And this is what needs to be discussed, but you can see there's a lot of fervor and reaction. And in the Zimmerman trial, you had the prosecuting attorney denying that race was a factor. You had the defense attorney denying that race is a factor. The judge denying that race is a factor. And everybody on the jury, 6 people who classified themselves as white, even though one was Hispanic. Everybody ended up saying race was not a factor. Well, racism cannot be maintained unless it is denied. The denial of racism is essential to its maintenance. In other words, the white population cannot come forward and say, listen, this is what we have to do if we are going to survive genetically. We have to have guns and we have to be able to kill black people, black men especially, anytime we start getting nervous about our minority status or getting nervous about the fact that we can be genetically annihilated. They can't come forward and say that. And so there's denial at the level that the denial is actually America's primary psychopathology. See, and this is America, and incidentally, the word America has coded in it, encoded in that one word, the statement, I am race, which is absolutely stunning and profound.
Wow, I never even thought of that.
See, just lay out the words like, Scrabble pieces, A-M-E-R-I-C-A, and almost the only phrase that you can pull out of that using all the letters only once is I am race. And this is the fundamental issue that is confronting America. Indeed, it's the fundamental issue confronting the world. Mm-hmm. But let's just take America. This is the fundamental issue, and it could be the cause for a second civil war.
Well,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I like what you said about the fact that race is only important in a system of racism, because often when I try to talk about racism, a lot of people respond with the fact that, there is no race. It's a social construct. We're only one race. We're the human race. Yeah.
See, that's fanciful hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
You see, because every person who classifies themselves as white knows who is non-white. Every person. Because that's absolutely essential. Consciously and or subconsciously, people have to know how to handle a person who goes in the bank to get a loan. People have to know how to handle a person who goes to buy a car. People have to know what interest rate to give to a person. And it's always a disparity in terms of what is given to whites as opposed to what is given to a person classified as non-white, so that the power equation of white power over a relative non-white powerlessness is maintained. That power equation, white power over a relative non-white powerlessness, that power equation has to be maintained for the purpose of white genetic survival. So this is the level of discussion that we need to be at if we're going to avoid a second civil war. I mean, I'm not saying that to frighten people. I'm only saying that because of the significance. The first Civil War, people have translated it, why did it occur, in many ways. Lincoln said he needed to have emancipation of the Africans, enslaved African people, to break the back of the South. But I say even a more fundamental reason was that if the millions of Africans who were enslaved on those plantations that built the financial foundation for America, if they had been emancipated and made socially equals to whites, so that everybody, regardless as to color, everybody, followed Dr. King's idea, everybody loves, nobody's thinking about skin color, white would have disappeared, and this would have been a country of colored people. See, Abraham, every slave master, because they were breeding slaves. Thomas Jefferson, I think 11 presidents owned slaves, and they had to breed slaves in order to make more slaves. And the slave masters were having sexual relations like Thomas Jefferson with the African women. So they saw white genetic annihilation taking place every single day. So that was fully understood. And so they had to make critical decisions. Well, we can emancipate them, but then we have to lock them in with the so-called black codes. And the word reconstruction, I maintain the word really means the reconstruction of white domination over the emancipated, enslaved African people. See, so this is absolutely critical. Now, in psychiatry, we say as long as the process is going on at the subconscious level, then the person doesn't really have the opportunity to have control over their behavior. The man who's running for mayor of New York, Weiner, I think that's his name, who has a problem in the arena of sex where he goes on the internet and exposes himself. Now, if he's supposed to have been in therapy, but some of the behavior was continuing, psychiatry feels that if people begin to gain insight into their behavior, get a deeper understanding of why they do the things they do, then they have an opportunity to be more effective if they seek to control that behavior. But as long as you're going on in a state of blindness or in a state of denial, and I say that apparently the masses of people who classify themselves as white are engaging in denial of their comprehensive social practice of racism, white supremacy. The Washington Post from yesterday reported that the number of people who strongly disapprove of the jury's not guilty verdict. Only 22% of people who classify themselves as white disapprove.
Yeah, I saw that.
And 84% of black people disapprove.
Mm-hmm.
You see, and that's the racial divide.
Exactly.
Now, that racial divide, you see, just like racism keeps surfacing, some dimension of racism or another keeps surfacing because it's the big white elephant in the room or under the rug.
It's the big
white reality.
It's the big white elephant because we're always all these things divide along racial lines. So, what do we think about the 22% that have agreed that federal charges need to be filed against Zimmerman? Are those 22%, have they gotten healthy somehow in some way?
Well, do you see, it's, there were people who classify themselves as white who voted for President Barack Obama. Now, they could say, well, I'm liberal or whatever, but the test for whether a person who classifies him or herself as white, the test as to whether they are or are not racist, and I don't mean that in terms of name calling. I mean whether they are practicing conscious and or subconscious racism, white supremacy, is whether they can allow a discussion of racism. Mm-hmm. You see, Anderson Cooper is talking about racism on CNN, but he gets fidgety at certain points. Mm-hmm. If a black person makes a particular point, he starts getting nervous and fidgety. Mm-hmm. In other words, there can only be the most superficial level of discussion, but not any in-depth discussion. Like, in other words, Mr. Anderson, if a person of your complexion and a black person had a child, then that child would be black, some shade of non-white. White would be genetically annihilated. No matter how many times you try to have a child with that person, it would always end up being a colored child. Are you comfortable with that? Which is the same question as, are you comfortable with being genetically annihilated? Mm-hmm. And so I say that people who classify themselves as white have answered that, because when they look at President Obama, strangely, interestingly enough, they're looking at white genetic annihilation. And so then when he starts to move and say, we're going to do certain things, then there's a massive reaction. You see, in other words, it's one thing to sit quietly in the Oval Office, and it's a black face sitting in the Oval Office. But when that black face begins to say, this is what we're going to do, this is the policy that I want to see in place, I want to see everybody have health care, then he is dismantling racism, white supremacy that necessitates that black people and other people of color not have health care so that they die earlier. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, but so they see it as some sort of zero-sum game. Do you know what I mean? It's like...
Say that again.
In other words, the pie is limited.
In other words, the power, who holds the power, has to be restricted. You see, because what's the issue that is coming up in America? The people who classify themselves as white are getting ready to be a minority. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody did a survey and asked people who classify themselves as white, how do you feel about becoming a minority in the next decade in America? Mm-hmm. So that white people are the minority. Are you comfortable with that? You see, I would wager that 100% of people would say, I'm not comfortable with that. Mm-hmm. You see, it's just like if you ask 100 white people, how much money would you have to be paid to change places with a black person?
Well,
a white person would give a high number, because even if they said, I'm not racist, they know that black people are not being treated the same as white people.
Well, I even posted on my Facebook page, would you rather be rich and black or white and poor? And I found that a lot of people, because I do my own, studies, they're not controlled studies. But anyway, I do
your own surveys.
Yeah, I do my own surveys on my Facebook page, and I found that many white people, they couldn't even say black. Do you know what I mean? They couldn't say, I want to be black. But anyway.
Well, you see, in other words, white people want to have a skin tan. They want to be able to spray some orange paint on them. But they don't want to be permanently tan or black in a system structured for white supremacy. Mm-hmm, 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 See, the whole system, the whole global dynamic is structured for white supremacy. I maintain that from the 15th century when Columbus came out of, started the circumnavigation by Europeans, by white people of the globe. And when those white men sailed around and they found out that the majority of the people on the planet were colored people, and if they waited around 9 months for the boats to be repaired after they had sexual relations with the colored women and saw the children all were colored, not white, they realized, wait a minute, white can disappear. So we have to control all of the colored people. That was colonialism, imperialism, white domination, whatever. We have to control and we have to maintain the control, and we have to be able to kill non-white people. We have to be able to kill non-white men for the purpose of white genetic survival if we're going to survive as white. All the turmoil that is going on in so-called Europe is because you have people from Africa moving in to Europe, and they complain about Islamization. But what they're really saying is, wait a minute, if we keep letting all these colored people move in, Europe will turn colored.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to take a break now. We're talking about, what I like to say, if we can ask why sexism exists, why do we have sexism? Why can't we ask why...
See, in other words, what's the definition of sexism? What are you talking about?
Right. We're going to take a break, but we'll get to it when we come back from the break. So I'm going to give out the call-in number. If you have questions for Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the call-in number is 1-888, that's 888-909-1050. If you have questions, 1-888-909-1050. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about sexism, and we're going to take your calls. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Kathleen Wells Show, and my guest is Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. We're talking about white supremacy and racism. And now we're going to touch on this issue of sexism. What did you want to say about that, Dr. Welsing?
I was just going to ask, when you say sexism, what are you talking about?
Well, I don't know if I necessarily have a definition for it, but I know that term exists. And so I know that people like to deconstruct and try to understand why there is sexism.
So what do they mean? I'm just asking just for clarification.
Right.
What are you saying sexism is supposed to be?
I'm not sure. I
know I have, but I'm asking you.
Oh, well, I think it's patriarchy, the suppression and oppression and subjugation of women.
Okay, let's stop there.
Okay.
Okay, in the system of racism, white supremacy, if you ask a black person, if you ask a black child, who is the dominant person in your household? The mother or the father? What is the black person going to say?
The mother.
The mother. The mother. Who has an easier chance getting a job between the black male and the black female?
The mother.
The black female.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're not talking about black people.
Oh no, I don't.
No. I'm going for the purposes of discussion.
Okay.
Okay. In the system of racism, white supremacy, what do white females say is their ideal mate?
Oh, well, I know your answer because I've heard.
Okay, what does she say?
Tall, dark, and lovely.
Tall
and handsome.
Dark and handsome.
Yeah.
So that in a system of racism, white supremacy, where the system is about, even though it's not talked about, it is about white genetic survival. So if the white female was saying her ideal mate is tall, dark, and handsome, she would contribute to white genetic annihilation if she was free. Which is, now that you've got some degree of women to live, what do you have? White women going after black men. Am I correct?
Yeah, you're correct.
You see, so so-called sexism is about keeping white women under wraps so as not to destroy, even though white males, white females do not talk about it. You know, they talk about equal wages, equal opportunities, etc. But nobody in the system of racism, white supremacy, talks about racism, white supremacy at the level that I'm discussing it.
Mm-hmm.
You see, it's just like how come there is pressure about women having abortions? Why isn't that? Why can't that just be left to the woman as it should be? That's her body.
Mm-hmm.
No, but a major segment of the system of white supremacy that is aware of whites getting ready to be a minority in this area of the world. No, we need all the white babies we can get. How dare you kill a baby? Now, if it's a non-white baby that the mother can't afford to take care of, it doesn't matter if that baby is killed by, not having an education, not having enough money to live on, et cetera, et cetera. So, in other words, when people are talking about a right to life, and at the same time they are manufacturing guns and dispensing guns, you see, that belies that the right to life, if there's a right to life, if people really believe and value human life, there wouldn't be the level of killing. But I say that racism, white supremacy is actually a system of mass murder. It's a system that has to justify murder, local, national, global, for white genetic survival.
Well,
so you turn on the TV and all kinds of people are dying in Afghanistan and Africa, you see, as well as on the streets in the urban centers. Do you see that people are trying to shift gears and, well, what about blacks on black killing each other? Well, black people are killing each other out of their frustration, their lack of understanding, just like white people lack understanding of the system of racism, white supremacy. But men who don't have jobs are highly distressed, whether they're white, black, brown, red, or yellow, because the society says that men are supposed to be able to support themselves, support a wife, and support their children. Well, black people have unemployment rates. Black men have unemployment rates that are like 50%, 30%, 40%. These are above depression levels of unemployment, that not just for 1 year, 2 years, but chronic mass unemployment. And so there's a high level of frustration. The system makes certain that drugs and guns come into, okay, well, you can sell drugs. And then we have laws that are disparate laws, and we can incarcerate you. So we can call that locking up your genetic material, throwing the black family to an imbalance so that black male children don't have father guidance. And we can have the effeminization of the black male child because they don't have fathers. And so the effeminization of males lead, all roads lead to Rome. So the effeminizing of the black male will lead to white genetic survival. You don't have male functioning competition. So this is the critical issue: racism, white supremacy, a dynamic power system that has logic behind it. Now, some people, I've had colleagues who say that racism is psychopathology. I say, no, racism is a system that people consciously, subconsciously put together for their genetic survival, being a tiny minority that's genetic recessive. What is the psychopathology is the mass-level denial of racism. I just saw a patient in my office. A black woman made a charge of sexism and sexual harassment against a white male person. And this was in a governmental situation, government-controlled situation. And the outcome ended up with her being sent to a psychiatrist, sent for a psychiatric evaluation. And because she was talking about racism, she was given a diagnosis of paranoia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that when the singer, I can't think of her name, was sent to prison for not paying her taxes, and she wanted to talk about racism, white supremacy, and they sent her to a psychiatrist also.
Because, see, and this is, I'm the only psychiatrist in the United States of America who is talking about racism consistently for 40 years. Now, this is a tragedy because racism, white supremacy, is the reality.
But so what are your black colleagues doing in the field in psychiatry? What are they?
Well, they want jobs. Do you see, just like anybody on a job, the black people will talk about the racism and discrimination on the parking lot, but if somebody files a lawsuit, for the most part, the other people disappear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's because of the pressure and the attack. See, an attack comes into play if a black person seeks to talk about racism. And I'm saying it needs to be talked about from a mental health point of view. It needs to be talked about to hopefully prevent a second civil war.
You're taking it to a whole nother level. And we just don't get it. We just don't get it in the mainstream media.
Well, no, in other words, you say what classification, what racial classification do the people who control the media give to themselves? Do they say they're white or non-white? That's the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we take a call?
Okay. Non-white people don't control the media. Are we in agreement?
Oh, we don't control anything. I work in the media. We don't control anything.
Okay. So people who classify themselves as white who control the media, and so they also control whether or not racism is going to be discussed all the time. Like sometimes people who classify themselves as white will say, well, Dr. Welsing, how can I help? And I say, look, tell black people what white people talk about when there are no black people around.
I try to get them to admit it on my Facebook page, but I just can't get it done. So, it's like, are you shocked? So, but they won't say it. If you don't discuss something openly, you're hiding something.
Well, see, in other words, I just say to white people who say that, I understand. What you don't want to reveal is the discussion that takes place socially, whether in business or wherever the discussion is taking place. Those are code discussions about white genetic survival. A white college professor said to me, Dr. Welsing, I hate to admit it, but on all social occasions, when white people are together, and she said, and there are no black people, we are always talking negatively about black people.
I believe
told
that.
her I understood, because what you're talking about is white genetic survival.
Yeah, I believe that. Why don't we take a call now from Linda in Texas. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Kathleen. Hi, Dr. Welsing.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Cress Welsing, first of all, I want to thank you so very, very much for your commitment, because you easily could have turned your back on us as a people and made millions and millions of dollars. So thank you for staying at home with us, if you will. I want to ask you, given that we're being systematically annihilated through the closing of, I believe, 54 public schools in elementary schools in Chicago, the main public library in San Bernardino, California, there was discussion about closing that and selling off all of the books. And then the price, the pricing markup of Black history books on sites such as Amazon, and of course the absence of educators and mental health professionals like yourself on daily television. What resources or one resource would you recommend to parents to teach their children the skills of critical thinking and analysis?
Well, you know, when we were in formal enslavement, and black people could be killed or they could be maimed, you know, have their hands cut off or other barbarisms if they tried to learn how to read.
Yeah.
But you had black people, if they had to teach reading on a dirt floor with a stick and writing on the dirt floor, they were determined that they were going to teach each other how to read as best they could. And they were determined under those horrific conditions that this is what we're going to do out of our respect for ourselves. Now, what we have to begin to realize at this stage, and this is what I say, the Trayvon Martin case. You know, I can hear Trayvon Martin, figuratively speaking, calling us from the grave. Don't just moan over my death. This is an opportunity, black people, for you to wake up and respect yourself and focus on the racism, white supremacy in the minds of George Zimmerman and all of the people involved in that case. To focus on and understand racism, white supremacy. And so we have to begin to see our goal objective from slavery forward was to integrate and to be accepted as Americans, to be accepted. That was our fault. To be equal. But we didn't understand that for everybody to be equal and circulate together in love, and if that was expressed in sex, that there would be white genetic annihilation. And the white determination for white genetic survival, conscious and or subconscious, could not tolerate that. So we've been on the train. I say went to the train station, got on the good train integration, and find ourselves at junction genocide. Do you see? Because integration cannot be linear, where black people are allowed to develop to the maximal level of their genetic and constitutional potential. That cannot be allowed in a system that is structured for white genetic survival. So we just have to, you know, it's just like I've gone to a train station one time and got on the wrong train. So what do you have to do? You have to go back to the station and get on the right train. And I say the right train for us is not talking about hating white people. We don't have time and energy to waste, and it's cheap to hate people. So I'm not talking about hating people, but we have to go back to the station and get on the train that goes to counter racism, and the last stop, or the next to the last stop is justice, and the next stop is peace. You see, so we have to get on the right train, and we have to go back to the station and to get some baggage about self-respect. Self-respect and self-appreciation, because during the interim, black people came out of the civil rights era talking about black is beautiful, black pride, black self-respect. And the system said, my goodness, these are people who had so much respect for themselves. They were giving their lives to go forward and to have justice. Their self-respect was so high that it became dangerous. And the system said, we've got to transform all of that black self-respect into the acceptance of being trash. We've got to train them to call themselves the N-word, the B-word, gangsters and thugs and dogs and bow-wows, and say learning is acting white. We've got to completely annihilate their self-respect. And we've got to pay their entertainers millions of dollars to put this psychological destruction in place on a beat. and we have to tell them they're being entertained. And so now we have brought them to point zero. We have brought them to a point of participating in their own genocide. So we have to understand that. And, you get on the wrong train, you're not going to stand in the station and beat yourself over the head with your suitcase. No, made a mistake, made a miscalculation, didn't have the correct analysis of the situation that we are in. And since we are the parent people on the planet, we're the mothers and fathers of everybody on this planet, including white people. White people are a mutation to albinism from black people. So we're the parent people on the planet. And, I'm a general psychiatrist and child psychiatrist. And so if children are having problems, they come to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist who's dealing with families help the parents get in place, help the parents regain their position, regain the understanding that they need to have to get the house in order. So I say this is the position that we are in as black people. And let me be absolutely clear. I'm not talking about hating white people. I want every white child that's born on this planet to be developed to the highest level of their genetic and constitutional potential. But I want every black, brown, red, and yellow child on this planet also developed to the highest level of their genetic and constitutional potential, as opposed to being inferiorized by a dynamic of racism, white supremacy.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you. Excuse me. Well, thank you, Linda, for calling. So, Dr. Welsing.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Welsing. We have, 3 more minutes, I think. So give us a remedy. Give us your remedy for today.
And the agenda, first and foremost, is that we have to have a deeper level of understanding of racism, white supremacy. And we have to stop denying that it exists. And then I'll just lay out the behaviors that Neely Fuller Jr. recommended in his textbook for victims of racism, white supremacy, that I call exercises in black mental health and black self-respect and counter-racism, building a culture of counter-racism so that we can transform a system of injustice to a system of justice. And this is for black people. Stop name-calling one another. Stop cursing one another. Stop gossiping about one another. Stop squabbling with one another. Stop being discourteous and disrespectful to one another. Stop stealing from one another. Stop robbing one another. Stop fighting one another, and stop killing one another. Now stop snitching on one another for reasons of personal gain. These seem like very simple behaviors. But if a person just practiced stop name-calling one another, they would transform the circle that they are socializing in. If they didn't gossip, so people gossip and bring them gossip, they never pass it on. So these are very fundamental, significant behaviors. And I add to that, stop using and selling drugs to one another. Stop making black children think that as children they can be adequate mothers and fathers. Black people under racism need to be 30 years old before they reproduce. And they need to spend those 30 years getting an education and skill training. Stop throwing down trash where black people live, work, and play. Stop believing in welfare, believe in prosperity. Stop pretending that racism, white supremacy does not exist.
And also, can I add, learn what racism, white supremacy actually.
Oh, absolutely.
Learn what that is. Because I have black folks who say, "Oh, Kathleen, you're a racist." Even black folks call me a racist.
No, well, you've got to correct that. I'm going to have to flee right now. Somebody's patient is here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Welsing. We'll have you on again. I love having you on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we were just listening to Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who's a psychiatrist who practices in Washington, D.C. Her paper is the ISIS Papers, The Keys to Colors. Please check it out. Thanks. I'll see you next week. Bye.